Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Morrison, and I'm the Adult Services Manager and Assistant Director here at the Scarborough Public Library. And before we begin, I would like to read this land acknowledgement that was approved by the library's Board of Trustees on May 20th of this year. The Scarborough Public Library acknowledges that it is located in the traditional homeland, past and present, of tribes in the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes who comprise the Confederacy, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseets, and the Micmac, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge the Owaskawag people who once lived in what is now Scarborough. We respect the traditional values of these tribes and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. Thank you. Welcome to the Butterflies of Maine, Biology, Identification, and Conservation. We are pleased to present this program in cooperation with the Friends of Scarborough Marsh. Dr. Philip Desmonardier joins us to introduce the Butterflies of Maine, including those we can expect to see here in Scarborough. We'll learn more about these important and intriguing insects and the threats they face from habitat loss, pollution, and climate change. Hopefully, we'll take away some advice on how we can help protect these and other pollinators. Philip is a supervisory wildlife biologist for Maine's Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, where he's worked for 22 years with a focus on non-game and endangered species biology and policy. He has co-authored over 40 scientific publications, is active on several state and national wildlife technical committees, and serves on the graduate faculty at University of Maine's Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology. Philip received his doctorate in wildlife ecology from the University of Maine in 1996, where he studied the effects of forestry practices on amphibians. His recent projects include co-authoring and implementing Maine's 2015 State Wildlife Action Plan, leading IFW's effort to identify and protect high-value vernal pools, coordinating statewide atlasing and research efforts for butterflies, dragonflies, amphibians, and reptiles, and advising landowners and land trusts on best management practices for rare and at-risk species and habitats. And we're thrilled that Philip could be here with us tonight virtually to discuss his beautiful insects. So I'll hand it over to Philip, sorry.
Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us. And hopefully you're seeing my full screen now, the title slide. Yeah, I really appreciate that folks are showing up. It might seem a little odd to have a butterfly talk as we're getting ready for fall and winter, but you'll find out as we touch on the biology that there's really no bad time to talk about butterflies. They're always out there in some form, in some part of their life history. I'm also glad that the Red Sox wrapped things up yesterday, and I'm not competing with another Rays playoff game. So that would have been a hugely poor decision on our planning part long ago. So yeah, I'm going to talk about biology, a little bit of identification, and wrap up with some conservation. These are the topics in sort of the order that I was thinking about. I thought we'd start really big picture, just remind everybody about the importance of invertebrates generally, and really at a global scale, and just how important they are, how abundant and diverse they are. And then we'll drill down to the subject at hand, butterflies and moths. We'll talk a little bit about their biology and get on the same page, sort of some of the unique things about Lepidoptera, the group, the order of insects that comprises butterflies and moths. Then we'll do a little bit of identification, obviously not much, but there's 5 families, and I think we can touch on just some characteristics of each family. a few teaser results of the Maine Butterfly Survey project that took place over a 10-year period and recently wrapped up, and then a few comments about conservation before opening it up for discussion. So this slide is probably conveying something that most of you already know, but it doesn't hurt to put real numbers on it. And it is a little bit dated. This is from data from E.O. Wilson's book in 1992, which shows about 1.4 million species distributed among major groups and by the number of species. Today, there's more on the order of 1.8 to 1.9 million species described on Earth. And guess what? Scientists still think that there's anywhere from 3 to 15 million species to be described still. So stay tuned in terms of what there is to learn about biodiversity on Earth. But the pattern that we see now is very likely going to be the pattern that we see moving forward, if not even more pronounced. And that is that insects, the bar on the far right, this group of organisms comprises about half of all life on Earth. And that's huge, right? Half of all life on Earth and 3/4 of all animals. And in fact, if you were to take that's the second column on the right that has the nice charismatic vertebrates sitting on top of it, other animals is the vast majority of other animals are non-insect arthropods, so things like crustaceans, millipedes, centipedes, spiders, and then other groups of invertebrates, major invertebrate groups like mollusks and worms and a whole bunch of marine phyla. So really, in terms of invertebrates, 95% of life on Earth is an invertebrate. So if you care about biological diversity, you pretty much have to care about insects and invertebrates. And to bring this home for purposes of tonight, our subject, of course, is butterflies and moths, just trying to put it in perspective here. So in Maine, there's about 3,000 species known so far of Lepidoptera, the order of butterflies and moths. And it's one of 26 orders of insects in Maine. And in most of North America, we have 26 orders of insects. So if we just take this one order of insects, there are more species in this one group of insects than there are all of the mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians times 5 in Maine. Well more than that number. And, that just gives you some sense of just how numerically species rich this group is, albeit Lepidoptera is one of the more rich groups of insects. But there are certainly others, Coleoptera and Hymenoptera, very rich as well. So they're super, super diverse, but they're also very ecologically important. And in fact, E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard biologist, in The Diversity of Life, a book that I highly recommend, just as relevant today as when it was written in 1999, calls them the little things that run the world. And what he's referring to is the fact that they play such a foundational role in terms of ecosystem services on Earth for humans and for obviously all other forms of life, that if they were to largely disappear, this group of animals, the insects, life on Earth would pretty much come to a screeching halt. And that's because of these just essential ecosystem services they're playing a really important role in. These are, pretty heady things. Where in these bullets, this is sort of the foundation of what makes life possible on Earth. And yet they just sort of trickle along. They're taken for granted. And guess who's doing most of the heavy lifting for nearly all of these functions? And it's invertebrates and very often, very specifically, in insects. And we'll just touch on a couple, say food chain foundations. So if you're having a hard time getting excited about insects, maybe you care a lot more about vertebrates. Consider the fact that most freshwater fish in Maine eat aquatic insects as their prey source, and that any good trout fisherman worth his salt, his or her salt, is going to tell you that a good trout stream is first and foremost a good stonefly and mayfly and caddisfly stream. Birds, there's over 90%. It may be well over that number, but certainly over 90% of the birds in Maine rely on insects during an essential part of their life history, mainly to feed their young. And guess what insect is just about the most nutritious insect that birds feed their young? It's caterpillars. It's the larval form of Lepidoptera. And bats, 100% of the bats in Maine and in the Northeast feed on insects, mainly nocturnal beetles and moths, another lepidopteran. Pollination, we hear more and more about the value of pollinators and the need to conserve pollinators, and that's because the vast majority of wild plants on the landscape are pollinated by insects, the vast majority, and a good chunk of the crops that provide the food that we eat are insect pollinated. These percentages go beyond well beyond the services provided by a few introduced insects like honeybees. I'm talking about the whole group, the thousands of wild bees and flies and beetles and butterflies and others that are providing these pollination services. So they're diverse, they're abundant, they're ecologically essential. Who's watching out for these guys? Obviously, a lot of groups are important non-governmental groups are playing a really important role, and citizens. But in terms of the sort of legal mandate and ability to bring regulatory powers to the protection of invertebrates in Maine, we're lucky in that the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife does have jurisdiction over invertebrates, and that's because wildlife in the department is defined as including all the vertebrate groups minus fish, just because they're pulled out in the definition, and invertebrates. So that's a big order, because if you consider, of course, all the invertebrates in Maine, you're talking about, even if we're just talking about the non-marine inland freshwater terrestrial invertebrates, we're talking well over 15,000 species that are known, probably closer to 16,000 or more that are, when we factor in species yet to be described or discovered. So that's a huge lift. That's a little bit paralyzing, in fact, for a department with limited staff and resources. So one of the ways that we embrace this mandate is to really try to focus, at least for invertebrates, on those species and groups that we feel we're confident have some issues at risk, some species that are vulnerable to extinction in the state. And so this is a collage that's put together by Mark McCullough, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist in Maine, who's also an artist, and it includes the 50 endangered and threatened species in the state. And as you can see along the margins, there are invertebrates because they are included as wildlife, and we can list them as state endangered, threatened, and other listing categories that I'll introduce you to later. Now, let's take a closer look at what those species are among the endangered, threatened, special concern, and species of greatest conservation need. Essentially the four categories of at-risk categories that we apply to all species in the state. Hopefully you guys can see the top of my screen, because mine's getting cut off all the time by the toolbar from the as the speaker, and by photos of myself, which is a little distracting, but hopefully you're able to move things around and see the full slide. If not, feel free to send a chat to the moderator, who can give me an alert to move something. But in any case, what you can see is that there's a good diversity of invertebrates represented here. quite a few orders of insects and other invertebrate groups. And butterflies and moths are right up there. In fact, quite frankly, if you were to look at what our list is comprised of, 2/3 of it is either, by list I mean a species that's been assessed as being endangered or threatened, special concern, or SGCN, and you'll see that 2/3 of those are Odonata, that is damselflies or dragonflies, or Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths. Now, is that because these groups are, in fact, the most vulnerable groups in Maine? Probably not, but they are fairly well studied. They're not hyper diverse. Scientists have been able to delve deeply and get a handle on their distribution and abundance and status. And so we feel more confident about assigning a status to them. With that said, there are quite a few butterflies and moths that we consider at risk. And so we do want to pay close attention to them. In fact, we know of a couple of species that have been extirpated from the state. So let's now move on to drill down a little bit more on the biology of butterflies and moths. Start real briefly here with a real brief taxonomic. Just checking the chat to see if looks like nobody's alerting me to issues with the screen. So here we are with the animal kingdom, of course, and we're working with an animal that's an arthropod, meaning it has an exoskeleton, not a skeleton, and jointed body parts and jointed legs, segmented body parts. And we're in we're an insect here as a butterfly, and so we are. That means we're an arthropod with 3 body parts: a head, an abdomen, and a thorax in the middle. And we have 3 pairs of legs, two wings, and most of them have antennae, most insects. And within the butterfly and moths, we're talking now about one of the 26 orders of insects, the Lepidoptera, which is, I think it's the origin of Lepidoptera, I think is Greek, and it refers to scaled wings, which is an important characteristic. It's a uniquely important characteristic to the Lepidoptera, at least hollow scales. That is, there's one other group of insects that have scaled wings, I think the caddisflies, but they're solid scales. And then there's 5 families of butterflies, and we'll be just briefly talking more about those later when we do the identifications. Screen is not advancing at the moment. There we go. So, but before we move on, let's just real quickly try to separate butterflies from moths, because this comes up a lot. And it's actually a difficult question, and one that even taxonomists still are refining distinction for, I would say. It's not a particularly taxonomically useful distinction, frankly, because moths, well, the most primitive moths are the ancestors to Lepidoptera. The most modern families of moths are actually more closely related to butterflies than they are to primitive moth families. But nonetheless, it's a popular distinction, and it can be useful. So we will just try to get on the same page. The bottom 2 photos are moths, top 2 are butterflies, and then we have what we think was the common ancestor, the most closely related insect group, caddisflies, that we think shared a common ancestor with butterflies and moths a couple 100 million years ago. So butterflies and moths are relatively recently evolved among insects compared to many other insect groups. And some of the ways you can tell them apart: moths in general, as you know, are nocturnal, not all of them, but the vast majority of them. So as a result, they're not relying so much on sight as a major sensory source. They're using chemical cues, pheromones, are a type of chemical cue that the females will emit, for example, to attract males, and that can occur across great distances, over several kilometers in some cases. Can pheromonal cues be picked up? And they'll do that by having elaborate antennae for picking up those chemical signals in some cases, although not always, as you can see on the bottom right. Because they're operating at night, so to speak, they're generally thicker thorax, they're hairier. That helps keep the thoracic muscles warm enough to engender flight. And then they will have they tend to be duller in coloration, right? Because they're flying around at night and not using visual cues as much. So a lot of whites and grays and browns. But the most useful characteristic, because there's exceptions to everything I just said between butterflies and moths, but pretty much I haven't been introduced to a single exception to the fact that all butterflies and skippers, some people consider them a subgroup of butterflies, but they're all butterflies and skippers, skipper on the upper right, butterfly on the left, have clubbed antennae, clubbed or hooked antennae, club in the case of the skipper. Whereas no matter how elaborate the antennae on some moths, or how seemingly similar in terms of their thread-like appearance, they won't have clubs. And so that should work pretty well for you. Be careful though, because as I said, there's a lot of exceptions, and there are very colorful day-flying moths. I'm not even showing the clear wing moths that you're probably even more familiar with, that visit your butterfly bush and other bushes during the day. But even these, if you look carefully, do not have any clubbed morphology to the tip of the antennae. The life cycle of a butterfly or moth is as such. It has a complete metamorphosis in that it has an egg, caterpillar, quiescent stage as a pupa or chrysalis, as it's usually referred to for butterflies, pupa in the case of moths, and then the adult. The egg is often laid on the host plant or nearby the plant that is then fed upon by the caterpillar, sometimes referred to as a larvae in the case of moths, or in butterflies, caterpillar, larvae, interchangeable. And that caterpillar will go through several instars. These are growth stages where it sheds its skin and grows in length and size and girth. It's basically an eating machine at that point, and its job is just to grow as fast as possible, because it's also a big fat food package for just about everything. It's probably, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Lepidoptera are the most important food source for the vast majority of passerines in the spring in Maine. In fact, they're so important that the whole neotropical migration phenomena has evolved to take advantage of the caterpillar resource in north temperate latitudes. But that's a whole nother story. In any case, these guys need to get out of this form as fast as possible, because everything is out to eat them. They enter this quiet phase as a pupa or a chrysalis, and then it's a deceptively quiet phase, because there's a lot going on inside that capsule. The caterpillar is essentially liquefying and reforming in the form of an adult butterfly morphology within the period of a few weeks, and emerges as an adult that generally has a very short lifespan. Just 2 or 3 weeks generally, if things go well. If things don't go well, it can be a lot shorter than that. There's parasites, predators, birds, insects, other insects, dragonflies, spiders. Just UV radiation over time will wear down the wings eventually if no predator takes the animal. Now, I talked about there's no bad time to talk about butterflies. We could be talking about them in January, and we'd find a relevant connection here. These are all the different phases that different life history stages that butterflies overwinter in, the size of the picture being reflective of the number of species that overwinter at that stage in Maine, not everywhere, but in Maine. And so, the vast majority of butterflies in Maine are overwintering as larvae, either early instar, young larvae, or late instar, generally not up on the food plant, but down in the litter below the food plant and below the snow, hopefully that will come. And actually very few as adults. And that's because it's really hard to overwinter as an adult. Those few that do, and I think I have a complete inventory of those that do in Maine listed here now. They do, the ones in white actually overwinter here in Maine as adults. And that includes about a half dozen species of commas and 2 species of tortoise shells and the mourning cloak that most of you are probably familiar with. And they're doing that by having pumping glycogen, sugary substance, into their body tissues to lower the freezing point of the body, and seeking shelter in wood piles, sloughing bark, barns, outbuildings, brushy piles in the woods, etc. The other way to make it as an adult in the winter is to not make it here and to migrate out of here. And that's what the ones in yellow are doing. And they're migrating south, sometimes short distance and sometimes really long distances, as in the case of the monarch. And it's worth pausing for a moment to talk about the monarch, because it's just unbelievable what they are, sort of epitomizing in terms of the capability for migration in butterflies. This is probably one of the most outstanding wildlife migrations in North America, if not the world. And I say that because this is an animal that's less than a gram in weight. And it basically, I hate to say it, but you'd be hard pressed to say that it even has a brain. There's probably a little concentration of nerves there at the front of the head, and we can call that a brain, but it's pretty darn small. And furthermore, they are several generations, 2 or 3 generations removed from their ancestor that made the trip to Mexico. And so let's follow this for a moment. So the ones in Maine are traveling probably as far further than any other North American monarchs in the country. So they are traveling over 3,000 miles, along with the entire eastern North American population, if you will, of monarchs, to just one mountain range west of Mexico City that was only discovered in the mid-70s by some really diligent naturalists that suspected this, and through marking and tagging monarchs like you see here, were able to actually track the routes and track a route that led them to suspected overwintering grounds that were eventually found. And tens of millions of monarchs will concentrate at this one site, and those will be the individuals that last bred here. So the monarchs that you're seeing out here in September in Maine and even early October are making this journey. And those same individuals are spending the winter at 10,000 feet elevation in the fir forests of this transvolcanic range west of Mexico City. And then after the winter, they're actually doing a 2-way migration, because that same individual that left Maine in your backyard in late September is then migrating north and breeding for the first time. It is the first time, because that generation that flew from Maine in the late fall is a non-reproductive generation prior to the winter, so that they can put more of their energy into wing biomass and a larger gliding capability morphologically. But they do breed on their way north in the Gulf states. And then a couple generations later, we have those individuals arriving in Maine in typically in early July, sometimes in late June. So it's just, it's still unknown to scientists how these animals are making this navigation possible, and doing it so consistently in terms of geography. let me just say also that there are two other populations in Maine. There's in North America, there's the western population west of the Rockies that's overwintering on the West Coast, making a shorter migration back and forth to the Rocky Mountains and in the summer and to the coast in the winter, and a mostly non-migratory population on the Florida Peninsula. But the vast majority of monarchs are located in are making this eastern North American migration to Mexico. Now, monarchs are one of the best studied butterflies really in the world, in part because of this fascinating migration that's attracted a lot of attention, and in part because that concentration in the mountains in Mexico does lend itself to a methodology that's fairly repeatable and quantifiable in terms of an estimate, a proxy for the size of the population. So obviously they're not counting individual monarchs, but what scientists are doing year to year is estimating the area in hectares that are occupied by a minimum concentration of monarchs. And these animals, the monarchs are just dripping off these fir trees. So they are indeed concentrated. And what you can see is that they've been doing this now for 27 years. I just uploaded the data here from the last winter, 2021. And the pattern isn't promising. There's significant decline in monarch populations, in Eastern North American monarch populations. There's many ways to calculate this, but several of the methods that are being used and reported in the peer review literatures suggest it's anywhere between 80 and 90% decline in the monarch population from the mid-90s. Another way to look at it would be to just look at the right-hand side look at the modern era on the right-hand side of the x-axis, and I think 13 of the 14 last years have been below the 27-year average in terms of area occupied. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has actually listed the monarch as an official candidate eligible for endangered or threatened status at this point. But back to the biology that we were on. Reproduction. This is a really key part, obviously, for all animals, and it's really fascinating among the butterflies and moths. So the male will transfer a spermatophore to the female, and unlike invertebrates where sperm is incredibly cheap and abundant and everywhere, it's actually a pretty expensive resource for butterflies. It represents 4, 5, 6% of the body weight of the adult male, and depending on species, and it's comprised of a whole bunch of proteins and lipids that are valuable nutrition for the female to help develop the eggs, not just fertilize them. The female will then lay the eggs on what's called a host plant or food plant. And you can see that happening here for the Baltimore checker spot. In this case, I think it's on, that looks like plantain. And this concept of host plant is really fascinating and important for Lepidoptera. I've used it a few times in the talk, and now I'm going to define it. Butterflies and moths evolved, as I think I mentioned, a long time ago, between 150 to 200 million years ago. And that was during the time when flowering plants were also just diversifying incredibly on Earth. And the two together have been evolving together, and in some respects sort of having a co-evolutionary competition of sorts, where the plants or an arms race, you could call it. The plants are have developed secondary metabolites to prevent herbivory, not just from butterflies and moths, but from everything. They have chemicals that are distasteful or indeed toxic to many different species. And butterflies and moths have, over time, over millions of years, developed some very precise enzymes to break down those anti-herbivory compounds. And sometimes that relationship has become incredibly specialized to the point where a singular species of butterfly can only reproduce on a few species of plants, indeed sometimes one species of plant. Not all, there's some generalists, but it's all caterpillars can only feed on certain plant species, and those plants are referred to as the host or food plant. And you can see here, we have an example of a Canadian tiger swallowtail on top and the spicebush swallowtail on bottom, just to illustrate what I would consider a relative food plant generalist on top, the Canadian tiger swallowtail that all of you see a lot of, I'm sure, most years. And that's because they're using over 20 different species of plants on the landscape from these 4 or 5 genera of plants: birch, aspen, cherry, willow, ash, really common early successional tree and shrub species that are all over the place. Whereas the spicebush swallowtail can only reproduce, its caterpillars can only digest and develop on spicebush or sassafras, mainly spicebush in Maine. And as you might predict, given these food habits and this level of specialization, you might expect that would affect their distribution. And indeed it does. This is data from the Maine Butterfly Survey that shows the distribution of Canadian tiger swallowtails statewide. Those white gaps in northwestern Maine are just places that haven't been visited because they're so remote. And the spicebush swallowtail on the right, which is completely confined to southern York County, which is the northern edge of the range of spicebush and sassafras, 2 rare plants in Maine, which in fact basically make this a very rare butterfly in Maine. Now, the specialization approach, it works. It has worked. It works really well in many cases because you generally have fewer competitors. There aren't often a lot of other caterpillars and species or even other herbivores that have the enzymes to break down those toxins in that particular plant. But it's a strategy that has become sort of short-circuited in the modern era with anthropogenic habitat loss. When humans begin wiping out rich spicebush and sassafras forests in southern Maine, that is a strategy that no longer works very well. And you'll see that theme repeated here a couple times, where habitat specialists among the Lepidoptera are really some of the most at-risk species now because of the decline in these specialized habitats. So let's move on to a little bit of identification. We'll do this relatively quickly. Again, we're in the Lepidoptera, right? The order has 3,000 species. Thankfully, we're just talking about butterflies and skippers tonight. So we're only talking about, for Maine, 118 species, or 124 taxa if we were to include the unique subspecies in Maine. But obviously a lot less, there's a lot more moths than there are butterflies. And that's true anywhere, any place on the face of the earth. There's generally an order of magnitude or more, in the case of Maine, of moths than there are butterflies. So be thankful that we're just working with the butterflies tonight. There are 5 families: the swallowtails, the whites and yellows, the gossamer wings, the brushfoots, and the skippers. And we'll just touch briefly on each one. There's only 7 swallowtail species known from Maine, so that's a manageable group. And in fact, there are really only 2 species that you are likely to see during the course of the spring and summer, and that's the Canadian tiger swallowtail and the black swallowtail, 2 common, secure, widely distributed species. The other species tend to be strays or more specialized. And yeah, this is obviously a really conspicuous group. This is our largest group of butterflies. They're so beautiful and elegant on the wing. That's in part because of those large tails, which convey some aerodynamic qualities that allow for a really graceful gliding flight. The other adaptation it's thought that these tails provide is to serve as false antennae, and that is birds that are attacking butterflies. They're obviously after the meaty, nutritious part of the butterfly, which is the abdomen and thorax and head. And they will use the antennae to help guide where they attack with their beaks. And it's been shown through experimental evidence that those butterflies that have tails intact attract more bird strikes to the rear of the butterfly where the tails are located than those of the same species where the tails have been artificially removed. And when that happens, the butterflies can escape with their vital organs intact. So it's a valuable adaptation among the swallowtails. And here on the lower left, you just see a common behavior what's often referred to as mud puddling, where the males, again, are collecting salts and nutrients to help, in fact, with the development of their spermatophores, which they'll be very important for reproduction, as we talked about. The whites and yellows, another family of relatively small family in Maine. The most common ones you're likely to encounter are the orange sulfur, flying still now. It's one of the latest flying butterflies. It's also a migrant, one of the few migrants among the sulfurs and whites. We have cabbage whites in Maine, obviously a very common white that you see everywhere, and clouded sulfurs. Those are the three common sulfurs and whites, but we have 9 species, and they as a group that they might not look like they're super colorful, but the whites and yellows are actually very unique. They're actually very rare colors in other butterfly groups. That's because those pigments are formed by what are called pterines that are really unique to this group. Hence the family name Piridae, I think. And yeah, so they're special in their own way, in both in appearance and behavior. They're multivoltine, meaning they breed all summer long and can accumulate really large populations flying from spring to late summer and fall. And then we have the gossamer wings. This is a really special group, quite diverse, and probably some of the most favored butterflies by many lepidopterists, and that's because they're just so exquisitely beautiful and intricately patterned, and their biology is really fascinating. They tend to be some of the most host specialized species, sometimes requiring just a single species like the one in the center of the screen, Hessel's hair streak, which can only develop, its caterpillars can only develop and feed on Atlantic white cedar, which tends to be a rare tree up and down the East Coast of the United States. And hence the butterfly is at risk in throughout much of its distribution, including in Maine. But a lot of the licinids, the gossamer wings, the hair streaks, coppers and blues and elfins tend to be quite specialized in the plants that they can develop on. And another specialization that a lot of them have, especially the blues and hair streaks, is a symbiotic relationship with ants, where the caterpillars are protected by ant colonies as they're foraging on these host plants. And in exchange, as driving this relationship is the fact that the caterpillars are exuding a honeydew secretion as they're feeding on the plant material, and the ants are eating this and mining that honeydew, and in turn protecting the caterpillars. And even caterpillars will even occupy the ant nests underground at the base of the host plants in some cases. Our most diverse group are the brushfoots, the nymphalids. These are the fritillaries, pearly-eyes, commas, ladies, and also our monarch is here, and crescents and checker spots. It's a big group, and it gets its name brushfoot, the common name, by the fact that the forelegs are highly abbreviated to the point where you really can't see them, as in that northern pearly-eye image. Remember, insects have 3 pairs of legs. You can only see 2 pairs there because the front pair are so reduced as to be a sort of non-functional really for ambulation. They're just used to taste the host plant leaves. They have little brush-like piercing structures on their tips, and they'll tap the leaves, assessing the chemical qualities of the plant and making that critical decision about whether it's the right place to lay their eggs. Because if they don't make that decision correctly, then their entire brood is doomed. And then the final group, the skippers. This is tends to be a difficult group. A lot of browns and yellows, very small, and a lot of amateur lepidopterists and naturalists might decide to forego the skippers, but eventually you should grow to embrace them, because they really are, each of them are unique, not just in their biology, but also in their appearance. You just have to look carefully. The field guides are really good now at separating them, and they comprise about 30% of our butterfly fauna, so they're not an insignificant group. There are two sort of subgroups among the skippers: the grass skippers that are mostly herbaceous feeding, host or plant feeding group, the larger group, and then the smaller group of spread wing skippers, like the sleepy dusky wing on the bottom left, state threatened species that is only feeds on scrub oak, but there are other spread wings that are also oak feeders, more generalized oak and woody plant feeders. So those are, if you once you can get to family, there's some really good guides now that'll help you get to species, which obviously we don't have time for tonight. I'll give you a few teasers on results of the Maine Butterfly Survey project that recently finished up. This was a project that started out with a goal, with an intention of being 5 years in length, but after 5 years transpired, and we had a cadre of trained volunteers statewide who didn't want to stop, we figured, why stop? And we kept going, and we collected data with citizen scientists statewide for 10 years, with two major goals, one being science and the other outreach. And I'll share some of the scientific findings here briefly shortly, but just keep in mind that by engaging citizen scientists in these projects of this kind, we're also we're developing a constituency of the public that cares about, is knowledgeable about, and then cares about this group of animals, in this case butterflies. But butterflies are, I think of them just as a gateway critter for invertebrates writ large. I mean, butterflies, they're colorful, they're conspicuous, they're diurnal, they're sun-loving. What's not to love about them as you're starting out to learn about a particular insect group? But once you find out about some of these incredible life history and biological relationships, that's hopefully some of which I've shared with you, you can't help but become fascinated and observant of all kinds of other invertebrate activity out there, which is in part the goal here. Other citizen science projects that our department is sponsoring, or has sponsored, or co-sponsored with other groups such as the Maine Audubon Society and others are shown here. The Bumblebee Project, the Dragonfly Project, and the Butterfly Project are pretty much not recruiting any more citizen scientists at this point. We're in the analytical mode of sort of studying the data and wrapping it up and trying to publish some results. But the Breeding Bird Atlas is active. Some of you are probably participating in it, I hope. The Reptile and Amphibian Atlas is active. It's been chugging along for over 35 years, probably the longest standing citizen science project in New England. And you're welcome to keep contributing to that. And I believe the Great Blue Heron Project is underway still. Here's a few just teaser metrics from the Butterfly Survey 10-year project. Some of our outreach contributions. We trained over 250 volunteers in workshops at Colby College, and a good number of those folks that went on to participate, and in fact leveraged other folks like their friends and family members, such that we had over 450 citizens contribute vouchers, either specimens or photographs that were usable and in our database today that we'll be using to get a better handle on the group overall. Scientific contributions have been more than we ever expected. We, in the 10 years of the project, we actually tripled the level of knowledge in terms of volume of records over what had been accumulated in the previous century of butterfly study in Maine. Many of those were new county records, and we're talking, a county is a significant extension of range. You'd be hard pressed to get a county record for a vertebrate in Maine. But you can still do that for many invertebrate groups, obviously, and we had many new state species records, including one new U.S. record in Maine. So some important findings. One of the scientific publications that'll be coming of this is one that's underway now, which is an atlas of the butterfly, an atlas of the biology and distribution of butterflies of Maine and the maritime provinces, because we've teamed up with our Acadian partners in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island to put together a regional atlas of the butterflies that will be coming out in the next couple of years. So just to show you what is possible when you do one of these citizen science projects, this is sort of the level of data contribution that accumulated over time from the earliest records that we knew about in the late 1800s and that are in our database that we accumulated from the literature and museum records. You can see that it was in about 2005 that we kicked off the atlas, and boom, just look at that, exponential growth in knowledge that occurred as a result. And so it's been really voluminous, the data that we've accumulated, and it's been geographically rewarding. You can see that on the left, if you just looked at historical species, and we're not talking too long ago, this is just pre-mid 90s, that was the status of the data after our first baseline atlas. And then immediately thereafter, well, not immediately, but soon thereafter, once we triggered launched the atlas and contributed data from over 10 years, you can see how we really helped fill in a lot of geographic blanks on the map. Finally, some words about conservation. So there are many threats to Maine's Lepidoptera, just as there are to all of Maine's wildlife and biota and biodiversity. One way to look at this, the level of threats, is to look at the number of species that are qualifying by some fairly rigorous criteria to be listed as state endangered, threatened, special concern, or SGCN, of which there are many among the butterflies and moths. And the factors that are contributing to this are the big ones are listed here. And the first three are probably pretty close to the first three for most species in Maine, outside of Lepidoptera even. Habitat loss is going to rise to number one for many, many species, not just in Maine, but across the globe. It's in fact one of the leading contributors to why we scientists believe that we are now experiencing only the sixth, but we are right now experiencing the sixth major extinction event on planet Earth, meaning that the level of extinctions occurring across all taxa on planet Earth right now are hundreds, by some estimates, thousands of times higher than the background rate that occurs between these very rare extinction events that have occurred over the 4 billion year history of Earth. We are in the midst of one right now, and habitat loss, introduced species of plants and animals, and climate change are some of the really major drivers for taxa across the board. Some of the threats that are somewhat unique, I suppose, to Lepidoptera and certain insect groups and pollinators are pesticides, artificial lighting, and I suppose overcollection. That's that you could consider overcollection what's often called overexploitation. And if you did that, there would be nothing unique here either, in that many vertebrate groups, especially in the tropics and areas where subsistence hunting is still taking place at a very large scale, overuse of species, overfishing, overhunting is driving the extirpation and extinction of many species. But in the case of butterflies, it's quite rare, and there's only a couple species that are really targeted by collectors. And it's arguable whether they really can make a dent in their populations. But pesticides, artificial lighting are somewhat unique and important threats. Now, you might wonder, how threatened can insects be? I mean, they seem to be abundant. If you just sort of casually think about the fact that you're sweeping flying arthropods away from your face pretty much any summer day in Maine when you're walking around of some sort. Well, that's the problem, is that obviously there's some very abundant species, but think about the diversity of species that I've talked about, and the fact that you'll never see 90+% of those 95% of the species that comprise invertebrates in Maine. And it may not surprise you that a lot of them are not doing very well. And in fact, if you were to look at the full list of extinct, meaning never to be found again on planet Earth, or extirpated, meaning no longer found in Maine, about half of them, as we know, as we know it today, about half of them are invertebrates, indeed insects. The reason I was stuttering there is because I was trying to think of how to say it, but essentially there's a whole bunch that clearly we don't know about. We know a lot less about the status of insects than we do about vertebrates, and I suspect there are many more insects that have been lost to the state of Maine that are not on this list. But for those that have been thoroughly documented, they comprise about half of the loss of the biodiversity in the state among fauna. What can we do about it? So we'll wrap up with just a few suggestions. There's many more, obviously, but the first one is sort of is an easy one, really, because it doesn't require a lot of money or a lot of action on your part. Just some curiosity, and just the fact that you're here tonight means that you're already engaging in number one, and that is just try to learn more. Be curious. You can never stop learning throughout your life about so many things, and I can guarantee you that invertebrates is one of those things. And as you learn more, your knowledge will inevitably lead to greater concern, and that very often will lead to action, some of the actions that we'll list below. And then well, before we leave that point, I promised to share a few of the special species from the Scarborough region. These are special, meaning that you're not going to run into these very easily or often, but they do exist in your area. And by area, I mean the town of Scarborough and the neighboring towns. And what I've done here is list by habitat some of the at-risk and notable species for your area. And I've also put their status on SC, meaning special concern, EX, extirpated, and E, endangered. And so you can see that they're in some of the dry barrens and xeric outwash fields where shrubby cherries and milkweeds and blue stem plants are growing. You'll find those are the hosts plants for some very special butterflies that are listed in your area there. In wet meadow and riparian settings, where you'll find large-leaf aster and wild sunflower and violets that formerly supported regal fritillaries in the Scarborough area, one of the few places where they were documented. That's a very important habitat for some unique species. Mature swamps, whether they're conifer swamps with Atlantic white cedar or hardwood swamps with woodland sedges, can support these two rare butterflies in the Scarborough area, Hassel's hairstreak and Appalachian brown. And then the upper, obviously, salt marsh is a big part of your mission and what's special about the Scarborough area. And even in the upper salt marsh areas that are where there's freshwater influence, you can get some unique and notable species such as the broadwing skipper and the bronze copper, beautiful, formerly listed bronze copper, although we found many more populations through the atlasing effort. And so you're probably getting the sense at this point that there's a lot of species to keep track of. And so the more efficient way to take care of these butterflies, whether it be in the Scarborough area, statewide, or in fact invertebrates writ large in the state of Maine, is to do a good job of protecting well-distributed representative habitats across the range of variation of that habitat in the state. And by doing that, you're going to capture the vast majority of habitat needs for these insects. So don't despair if you're not ready to learn each species and its host plant. If we do a good job of protecting habitat statewide, we will do a good job of protecting these species and many, many more. And when I say do a good job of this, there are some really valuable and professional and active groups near you now that just need your support. The Scarborough Land Trust, the Saco Valley Land Trust, Maine Coast Heritage Trust up and down the coast, the Nature Conservancy statewide. These are groups at a local, town, regional, and statewide level that are actively protecting habitat for these species and others. So just by joining and supporting one or more of these groups, you'll be playing a very important role towards probably the biggest threat to these species, which is loss of habitat. And this is all the more important in your area of the state because look at the graph on the left for a moment. This is number of rare, threatened, and endangered animal species in the state. And the darker colors are higher concentrations, greater numbers of species, of at-risk species. And you can see that it's in southern Maine, believe it or not in the wilderness hinterlands of northwestern Maine, but in southern Maine, where we have some of the highest concentration of at-risk animal species and plant species. And that is also the part of the state with the highest population densities, the greatest number of roads, the highest growth and development. And by the way, some of the least amount of conservation land, as illustrated by the graph on the right. So in green, you can see the conservation lands distributed statewide. And unfortunately, in the portion of the state where we have a very high concentration of specialized species whose populations are on the brink, we are not doing a particularly good job of conserving habitat. So there's a lot of work to be done still by land trusts in this part of the state, and your support will really be helpful in making that happen. Pollinator vegetation management, you'll hear a lot about this, and this is now getting a little more fine filter. Backing away from habitat conservation generally, and because we often get asked by landowners who own a particular parcel of land, and they've heard that pollinators are at risk, and they're not interested in just growing a crop or a single species of grass for hay or what have you. They would like to manage an open early successional setting in their back meadow or field for the benefit of pollinators. And by pollinators, whether they know it or not, they're talking about a big group of species. So the butterflies, the moths, the bees, the bumblebees, and bees at large. Flies are doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of pollination, including the flower flies, aptly named, of which there's a couple hundred species in Maine, and beetles. These are what we're talking about when we talk about pollinators. And so we're talking about a lot of species that can benefit by just some careful, thoughtful vegetation management that I won't have time to get into now, but there's a lot of good guidance on the web on this topic. And it sort of comes down to, if I had to just sum it up in a sound bite, your goal is to maintain as much native host plant diversity on your property as possible for these species, as well as nectar plant diversity. Those are two different things. Remember, the host plant is the plant that's feeding the caterpillars. The nectar is what the adult is providing the sugar water, in effect, that the adults need to feed on while they're flying around and being reproductive. And to do that, one of the best tools available to you is to maintain that open field setting with a lighter touch generally than what people are inclined to do. So basically mowing less and mowing later in the season will allow for a greater native plant diversity to succeed into that area, and yet still keep it from succeeding to a woody plant type. And so you're basically trying to get to this kind of a setting where you have a diversity of flowering plants. You've got violets and turtlehead and other interesting wildflowers in the understory, so to speak, of these nectaring overstory plants. And so you've got host plants and nectar plants all working together here to provide a really rich environment for pollinators. And finally, I would encourage you to, if you're interested in some of the things you heard tonight, and you believe me that that invertebrates are where it's at in terms of the biological diversity in Maine and worldwide, then consider joining and supporting one of the few groups that are really focused on invertebrates. In North America, one of those preeminent groups is the Xerces Society. You can Google that, and they have a great website, lots of guides on how to manage for pollinators. They're doing terrific work. Their organization is named after the Xerces blue, which is a butterfly that went extinct in western United States after its dune habitat was developed. And they're committed to having that never happen again. And they're working really diligently on at-risk invertebrates all across the country. And right here at home, there's the Maine Entomological Society, which is our own homegrown group of folks, mostly comprised of amateur naturalists just interested in bugs generally and wanting to learn more. There are some professionals there too that can help mentor folks along. There's only, I think, maybe 100 members, relatively small group, looking to grow. They have a great website and lecture series. They do want your support. And then, Frank, my organization, I will shamelessly say, is doing, I think, some good work with invertebrates, trying to partner with these and other groups, and doing that with the support of loon plate, conservation license plate, and chickadee checkoff funds to engage in invertebrate conservation and at least keep track of these most at-risk species. And so with that, I'll wrap it up and just remind you that there's only a few of us that are dedicated to invertebrates in the department. We also work with other groups, but we do include invertebrates in our mission. Myself, Beth, and Derek, we do this because we're able to partner with experts across the state, only some of which I've listed here. And these are really folks that are some of the leading experts in the field, certainly in the Northeast, and that we help leverage our efforts to really be more effective than we could ever possibly do alone. I do want to say that any of the decent pictures taken in this PowerPoint were not mine. That I had some generous contributions by the folks here, as well as some artists. And again, the non-game and endangered species funding in the department is in a large part contributed or generated through contributions generated through the loon license plate, purchases of the loon license plate, and contributions to the chickadee checkoff. And what's really important is that we can then use those stateside sources to leverage 2 or 3 times our stateside dollars by leveraging 2 or 3 times that amount from state wildlife grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So together, that's how we make it happen. And we really appreciate your support. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Philip. Let's see if anyone has any questions. Now's the time. If you can write your question in the chat box to everyone so that everyone can see. Let's see. So Barbara's asking, is it true that the southern migrating monarchs are a lot larger than the other generations? It is unusual to see them still in Maine this late into the year. Or is it unusual to see them still in Maine?
Yeah, I have not measured them myself. I'll be honest, but what I've read is that the last generation, the final generation of monarchs, be it in Maine or anywhere in northern latitudes in North America, is a non-reproductive generation. They're putting more of their energy into biomass, into wing material that will make them more effective at migrating this incredible distance south. And I would venture to say any of the monarchs that you're seeing now certainly are non-reproductive and better think about leaving town very soon, because obviously the first frost could come soon and that would be damaging to them. But, you know, we hear about monarchs, we hear about migratory species of all kinds, but certainly monarchs. People call in with concerns about after the first frost come in mid to late October, or sometimes early November, and they'll say, well, geez, you know, the monarchs in the state of Maine got duped this year, and we just lost so many of them to a frost. And the fact is that there will always be, it's like a bell curve. There'll always be some individuals out on the end of that curve that are pushing the envelope and making use of the possibility that warmer climate is coming. And indeed, those may well be. The genes that are of that adventuresome group may well get propagated quite a bit in years to come as climate warming continues.
We have someone who's thanking you for sharing your knowledge, but they want to know, what is the chickadee checkoff?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it used to be obvious what it was. My understanding is about 15 years ago or so, the chickadee checkoff was one of the few checkoffs that was right on the standard tax form. It's on the state tax form. But now, because there's a collection of checkoffs, other worthy organizations that have mimicked IF&W's approach now have their checkoffs, and so they can't fit them all on the main tax form. And so there's a supplemental tax form, and you won't ever see the checkoff unless you engage or ask for or pull up that supplemental. I don't remember what the supplemental number is on it, but it's you know, if you Googled the chickadee checkoff tax form, I'm sure you'd find it. But that's where it is, and any contributions are really valued.
Robin is recommending reading Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver, which is a novel that sheds light on the migration of monarch butterflies. And then Tom's asking, how far north and east have giant swallowtails been documented?
Yeah, they seem to be spreading. I think that was one of the swallowtails I had pictured on the swallowtail family slide, that beautiful large individual on the bottom right. There's a paper that recently came out documenting their spread in New England. I think their host plant is prickly ash, and a couple other plants that are if they're present in Maine, they weren't native here historically, but they're breeding on ornamental hosts that are in New England, and they're doing well. They're even having they're not just straying into New England states, but they're actually reproducing, although they can't overwinter here. And so they're sort of they're kind of doomed without without being repopulated from the south every year. But you're right, they are spreading, and we're seeing more and more sightings of them in Maine and throughout New England.
Robin's asking, are there plans for planting more host plants? This, I don't know if she means by the state or different organizations.
It's a good question. For obviously it would be a big job for all butterflies, and or even for all at risk, the subset of 2025 at risk butterflies. I think, before we did that, where we really ought to spend most of our effort is to protect intact natural habitats that are already rich in host plant diversity. So the bogs and fens and riparian meadows and boreal forests and hardwood seepage swamps and salt marshes and tundra and subboreal habitats all are going to have unique and native host plants that'll support these species. And as I said before, if we do a good job of protecting enough of those places across the state, that's probably the most efficient way to tackle the issue of host plant diversity vis-a-vis species protection. Now, with that said, there are a few species that are kind of falling through the cracks of and need attention sooner than later, and sooner than we're going to be able to protect enough habitat. And the Carner blue is one that comes to mind for the Northeast, for example, where in New York and New Hampshire, there have been efforts now to take what's very close, very nearly an extirpated species in the Northeast, and to supplement barren habitats with their host plant, just as you're suggesting. In this case, wild lupin. Not the lupin you see on the roadside all throughout Maine that's so pretty, but the wild version, which is now extirpated in Maine and may have taken the Carner blue with it. It's a little unclear whether the Carner blue was ever present in southwestern Maine, but we know that the wild lupin was. And that's what authorities are doing in New Hampshire and New York with NGO partners and academics is working together to reintroduce both the Carner blue and its host plants into some of these suitable barren habitats where the host plant has been extirpated. We could conceivably consider that here in Maine, but that would be a really hands-on and fairly expensive effort. And I'd just assume see us do a good job, at least initially, at protecting our native at-risk butterflies and their rare habitats before investing too much into that level of hands-on effort of direct stewardship.
The library's director, Nancy Kroll, is just reminding everyone that there's also a check off for public libraries on that list, on that tax form. So
very good.
You can check both the wildlife one and the public library one. And then we have another question. Is there a state information sheet that goes to towns in terms of mowing schedules, like along the Eastern Trail?
A state information sheet that has details on mowing schedules that would be of value to pollinators or butterflies in particular.
Not sure, maybe they mean when the state or the towns, whoever does the mowing along the roads, maybe that's what they're.
Yeah, I bet that is what they're getting at. I don't think there is. I think that's a great idea that departments like my own and Maine Audubon and other land trusts and other active NGOs should be talking more to the Department of Transportation's at the local and state level and right-of-way managers about not just mowing schedules, but the use of pesticides and which host plants to keep an eye out and avoid. And yeah, good comment. And it needs to be done. We do that a little bit, but not enough, would be my assessment.
looks like that is all the questions. Anyone have anything last minute? I will ask you, do you have any favorite guidebooks for butterflies that we should have at the library?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. Yeah, I'll email you, Catherine, some,
Okay.
but for the benefit of those that are listening, Ken Kaufman has a really nice field guide. I wish I don't have my library in this room. Don't remember what it's titled, but it's essentially a field guide to the butterflies of Eastern United States or North America, and it's by Kaufman. It's an excellent resource. Check and Tudor have a wonderful book. It's more of a coffee table book for when you get back from the field, but it's just loaded with really accessible life history and biology information and beautiful photographs too. And it's essentially called The Butterflies of Eastern US or North America, but in this case it's Czech, CECH, and Tudor, TUDOR.
Okay.
Those two right off the bat I would recommend. And within a couple years here, Cornell University Press will have a book entitled something like The Butterflies of Maine and the Maritime Provinces, and I highly recommend it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And this presentation has been recorded, so we'll have it up on our website soon if you want to watch it again. And we'll probably put some hyperlinks into some of those organizations and things you mentioned. And if anyone couldn't make it tonight, they'll also be able to come back and see it as well. So I want to thank you on behalf of everyone who came tonight. I want to thank you. It was very informative. I learned a lot of things I did not know. And I'm sure that's the same for everyone. So thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
And thanks
Good
everyone
night.
for coming. Good night.